My name's Jeff Baker, and my mother was born in Ely, Nevada, which is probably 150 miles or so from the Nevada test site. My father was born in St. George, and they both grew up in those areas. Mom went back and forth as she was growing up between a small town near Ely. The town is called Lund, Nevada. And she went back and forth over the years between Lund and St. George. Dad spent his youth in St. George and grew up there and went to Dixie College there for a couple of years. But they were married. I'm not sure what year it was, maybe, I don't remember, but that's okay. But they got married and spent much of each of them spent much of their youth in the Downwinders region. Well, both have passed away. Mom passed away in 1995. She died of cancer. My father died in 2004. His death was from heart failure. As far as we know, his death was not related to the nuclear testing. Mom's death almost certainly was, although we will never know for sure. She contracted cancer, started as breast cancer, and go into remission. And this is probably in approximately 1990-ish is when she first got cancer. But because she had spent so much time in the Downwinders area of southern Utah and Nevada, her cancer is almost certainly due to the testing. Her cancer spread throughout the body, and then it would go into remission, and then it would find its way to the surface again, and then she would get that taken care of. And so she went through several cycles, and eventually the cancer got into her brain, and that's what took her life. Over the years, I heard many stories from both sides of the family, from my mother's side and my father's side. Myself, I am not a Downwinder. I would consider myself a second-generation Downwinder because the nuclear testing did have a substantial impact on the lives of both of my parents. My grandpa describes being outside, he and Grandma being outside of the ranch house early one morning. So I would estimate this is in the early 1950s. They were ranchers, and they were working the ranch. The sun had not yet come up, and it was still mostly dark all around, as Grandpa described it. He and Grandma were working together, and suddenly, as Grandpa described it, the entire sky just illuminated. It became very bright. They could see the mountains only a half mile to the east of the ranch. They could see the entire valley. They could see mountains 10s and 20s of miles away. Everything was just brilliant. There were no shadows on the mountains. It was so brilliant. And the light rose very quickly. It stayed brilliantly lit for about 5 seconds. And then over the next 2 or 3 seconds, the light quickly subsided again, and suddenly all was dark again. There was no sound related with it, and it frightened them quite badly. They had no idea what was going on. And that was one of the stories that Grandpa shared. It was the first bomb that they knew of that was set off and that they had witnessed. I do have a few stories from my dad. An interesting one that he shared was when he was a student at Dixie College in St. George. So he would have been probably in his early 20s at the time. He said that representatives from the Atomic Energy Commission would occasionally show up on campus. And these people would go around and they would collect badges, was the word Dad used. And I said to Dad, what was a badge? And he described it as a piece of metal, maybe the size of a credit card, that some of the volunteer students would wear on their shirt, and they would simply wear it as a badge. And what it was a mechanism for the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, to measure radiation. They would seek out volunteers among the college students to wear these badges. And the reps would show up on campus every now and then. They would collect a used badge and replace it with a new badge, so they'd just swap the badges. And a few weeks would go by and the reps would show up again and again swap out the badges, and this went on apparently for a good number of months. And I asked Dad, how would they find you? And he said, oh, they'd just find you. They knew where to find you. And it kind of sounded a little mysterious or ominous in a way, that perhaps they were watching from behind the scenes a little bit. I don't know that for sure. But I thought it was interesting that the AEC was collecting radiation samples from the students themselves. My grandfather, I mentioned he was a rancher. He also worked as a security guard at the test site. And I was quite surprised when I learned that. But he would work there during the week, and then on the weekends he would return to the 6 Mile Ranch and do work on the ranch on the weekend and go back and forth between the test site and the ranch. He worked there for several years. The company, if I recall correctly, was called Federal Services. And he worked with them, I'm guessing, 4 or 5 or 6 years. He worked his way up and eventually obtained a top secret security clearance. He said that he was able to go into files and see top secret information even on the Soviet Union and what they had stored, or rather what the records had stored there on the Soviets. He was also present at many of the detonations that went off. He said he literally stood on the edge of many of the craters, looking down into them to see how deep they were. He described one detonation in which a large structure was built. It resembled a bridge, is the way he described it. In my mind, I pictured a bridge, something similar to a bridge that might go across the Mississippi River, a very large steel structure. He said the bridge, or the bomb, one of the bombs, was placed literally at the end of one of these bridges. And the workers all went away, they set off the bomb, and he actually watched this bridge structure, what was left of it, being thrown, he estimated 1/4 mile into the air and landing about 1/2 mile away. He said what was left of it, in his words, it looked like a pretzel. And I thought, wow, that demonstrates a lot of power to lift something that heavy, that high and that far away, and to damage it that much. I'll share another story with you, and this is of me and my father. We were driving towards St. George. We were between Las Vegas and St. George, and we got talking about the testing. And Dad mentioned that back in that time, the bombs going off was actually seen as, by some people, as entertainment. St. George being a small town back then, he described people on the early mornings that the bombs were scheduled to go off. People would drive to a location called Utah Hill, which was west of St. George. And there would be crowds of people there, cars everywhere, Dad said. Cars parked everywhere, people excitedly waiting for the bomb to go off 100 miles to the west. And then the bomb would go off, and these dozens and dozens of people, perhaps hundreds, who had gathered to watch this bomb go off. Ooh, isn't that pretty? Or wow, spectacular. And the light would subside. People would get in their cars and go home. The show was over just that quickly. And so back at that time, I share that to emphasize that I believe early in the testing, watching the bombs go off was a kind of entertainment. And it wasn't until a few years later that the effects of these bombs began to take root, and people began getting cancer. And it didn't take a lot of figuring for people in St. George, especially in Enterprise and other surrounding areas, to make the connection between the bombs going off and the amount of cancer in their communities increasing. And so that started changing people's attitudes, is the way my father described it. And people began disliking and distrusting the government. They were not agreeing with the propaganda that was being distributed. And they were really starting to look for a way to push back and to get the testing stopped, if possible. But it continued, and so there began to be a lot of antagonism towards the government in general, the military, their involvement. And so the emotions became quite heightened, as I understand it. For myself, I have to empathize with them, but because I never experienced it personally, I can't have the exact same emotions that they did. So I rely heavily on their descriptions, their emotions. Do I agree with it? I can't say one way or the other. Was it good for the country? Perhaps. Was it good for the people? I'd have to say no. Overall, was it necessary? I just don't have an answer for that.